And you have not even that, but you also have nuclear states that are ready to use nuclear in against Russia. Remember what Macron said? Remember what the UK said? Remember what Liz Truss said, that they were ready, she was ready to start a global annihilation to fight Russia. The problem that in the meantime, because she doesn't understand this, because she doesn't understand the Russians, because she doesn't understand the way the Russians understand war, she decided to militarize the EU and to have this rearm Europe and spend so many millions to reconstruct it and so on and so forth to create a second NATO. But if EU double as a military organization, then Russia will say, will not swap NATO for EU, because then we are back to square one. We are facing the same problem. Instead of having troops with the NATO flag, we have troops with the EU flag, which is the same kind of problem, since you have the same troops in you say the same countries, essentially, less probably the United States, but you also have nuclear states. And but Europe is a catastrophe, literally. And Ursula von der Leyen, that's where you see that those persons are not tailored, are not prepared, are not suited for the kind of job they have. They don't have, Ursula von der Leyen is well known that she had not been a defense minister extremely effective in Germany. That's why they promoted to the European Union, and they tried to get rid of her by promoting her in the European Commission. Now she's extremely proud because she's an ambitious and over-ambitious person, but there is nothing behind this. This is just a picture, but there is nothing behind. There's no depth. There's a very shallow person, in fact. And she speaks the German when they don't know things. They speak very decisively, like a very strong tone and all that, and they speak like this. But that hides inherent weaknesses, inherent inability to cope with problems, inherent inability to understand problems. We have, in fact, leaders who have lost the objective of what they were elected for. And therefore, we are in a total confusion. That will take years to recover a sound and sane situation, because because everything we talk here is not just words, discussion, peace, not peace, and all that. It has also implications. Because when we say not peace, that means you develop your, let's say, military industrial complex, let's say. Per se, it's not a bad thing to develop the military industrial complex. The problem is that, again, we develop this MIC at the expense of other development that would be more necessary to have. So it's totally confusing because nobody, in fact, works for its national interest. They are just working. The only common aim, if I can put it that way, is weakening Russia, even at the expense of sacrificing its own national interests, its national economy, jobs, you name it. So we create ourselves the problem that we try to fight afterwards. And that's, in my view, that's extremely confusing for everybody. And everything is possible, all this situation is possible, because nobody has a real understanding of a whole. Nobody has the big picture of things. Everybody reacts on a day-to-day basis on things, but nobody has the real big picture. Nobody wants. There is no. When you lead a country or the European Union, a group of countries, your limits should be the national or multinational interests. But who define them? Where are they? Nobody talks about them. And we have the feeling that the European Union has just forgotten that Ursula von der Leyen should be defending the interests of the EU, but she never defined them. Russia, but beyond that, you don't know exactly when it happens. When we talk about peace, when we talk about negotiation, when we talk about facilitating dialogue, that should be the role of the United Nations. Where is Gutierrez? Nowhere to see. Even my country, Switzerland, when we had during the Cold War discussions involving high-profile leaders such as US and Russia, Switzerland or Geneva used to be the ideal place for that. And the previous latest summit between the Russian and the US leaders was in Geneva in June 2021, by the way. But today, nobody believes that Switzerland is the best framework for that, because Switzerland is no longer considered as neutral, wrong or bad, or wrong or true. So we see that there's a confusion in the international order with that. Nobody knows exactly what is at stake, who works in the interest of whom. We have a total confusion, and that's largely provoked by the fact that everything that happened politically in the last 3 years had the only and sole focus at weakening Russia. See, we define new priorities based on air, literally, based on ideology. And therefore, the whole thing crumbles. That's exactly what you have with EV cars and things like this. The Chinese have developed a new ecosystem based on EV vehicles and all that, but they spend a lot of money to develop a network of distribution for electricity and things like this. This kind of ecosystem doesn't exist in Europe. But nevertheless, we decided there will be no thermal engine cars by 2035. Now, no car manufacturer is in a position to develop a car until then. And there is no network. If you go, Belgium has made a lot of effort saying this is a green energy and all that, but you have nowhere you have electricity to supply your car. So why would you buy an EV car if you're not able to recharge it? So all these things that must be developed as an ecosystem, not just by having one decision here and another decision there and things like this. And if it's a priority in Belgium, it must be a priority in other countries as well. Because if you travel with your EV car, you should have a recharging station somewhere when you go in France, in Germany, or in Italy. If those countries don't have the same priority, then you're just framed. I know people, they have an EV car, they went in vacation in Italy, and they spend all their time trying to find recharging station. So they wanted to tour in Italy. In fact, instead of visiting all the wealth of architectural fantastic buildings and things like that you have in Italy and scenery and all that, no, they spend all their time trying to find a recharging station. Because in the Netherlands or in Switzerland, in Belgium, this is not the same priority as in Italy or somewhere else, or maybe southern Italy. As a result, you cannot just decide we produce EV cars. And by the way, a lot of now car manufacturers have said that they will not produce EV cars because they can't. As a result, the law that was decided by the EU is irrelevant. So you make a law for nothing. But this law had implication because a lot of companies tried to achieve that, therefore invest or tried to invest in that, spend a lot of money for zero, for nothing, for no return. So we see that beyond everything we see today, the evolution, this affects long-term priorities. This affects the way you manage your own population. And you base your judgment on gut feeling, literally, because you don't like the Russians, so they must be the threat in 5 years. And therefore, you sacrifice a part of the population that probably needs more support, including pensions and things like this. So you have a lot of countries now, they are extending the age of pension and things like this. So I'm not saying it's not right. Probably it's a good thing in certain ways. And I don't want to open a debate on that. But that means that we shift priorities on things that are not even established by a proper assessment. We have employment is sinking everywhere. We are losing the know-how of things. We are sacrificing the knowledge because even our education system don't work. China, on the opposite, produce every thousands, tens of thousands of engineers and STEM graduates. Whereas in Europe, we see exactly the opposite. We are still developing STEM, but with the capacities that much lower than they used to be. So this is one thing, but also because we want to spend more. France, for instance, reduces its social contribution for people, but doubles its defense budget because in 5 years, France might be the primary target of Russia. And that level of education in Europe is sinking, literally. You have barely people who come to university, and I'm exaggerating a little bit, but they're barely able to read and count. This is tragic, literally. And we have universities that are downgraded. And if you look at the top 10 universities, and again, it depends on who makes the ranking because they have as many rankings as you have. But more and more, the trend is that you see more and more Chinese universities in that, at the expense of European universities. That's very interesting. And we see that the number of scientific publications and all that, they explode in China. And nobody reads them because they're written in Chinese, therefore nobody reads them. But in fact, those who have the opportunity to read them, they see that they are the highest level. And we are not able to compete with that, unless, therefore, when we talk about new technologies and new whatever, the Chinese are far ahead of us. And they don't spend money now. They are forced to spend more money on their defense, but they didn't spend all their money on defense. The problem is that he has not the big picture either. He's working on a different level, but it's still the sectoral thing and the day-by-day managing and micromanaging of things. So we see that this way of dealing with things, not having the big picture, but addressing issues based on a very tactical understanding of things, cannot work. And that's exactly where you see the weakness of the EU. And in the US, that should be more easy had the US a president that is able to have the big picture. First of all, the US is not and has never been a humanitarian organization. Therefore, the President of the United States, regardless of who he is, he has to deal for the sake of the US national interest. And it's legitimate to do. He was elected for that, after all. What you could complain about is the fact that in Europe, none of those leaders are acting in favor of their national interest. They're all working towards the US national interest. So that would be the question. So therefore, we can certainly complain about the ultimate aim of the discussion in Congo, in Azerbaijan, Armenia, and other places. We can argue on that. The thing is that beyond this, we have people who are not, we see that we have people who are not seasoned negotiators. They're probably good to discuss a deal for buying a building or things like that, maybe. But they are not able to address the complexity of the interests in international context. And that's my that was very clear with Keith Kellogg, in fact. And that becomes more and more apparent with Steve Witkoff, who, by the way, achieved almost nothing in the Middle East because nominally he is the special envoy for the Middle East. He achieved nothing there. And I'm not sure he achieved much more with the Russians, despite the fact that probably they have a good communication with Vladimir Putin. Yes, that's already something, you would say. But it's not of the nature of solving the problem. And that's becomes more and more apparent today. Again, we need to give a chance to the discussion that will come in Alaska in a couple of days. But I would not personally condemn the fact that the US president works for the US interest. The problem is that it's the way he does it. And here, look at the way the team of Trump is composed of. Instead of having people with seasoned diplomat and people used to foreign policy and things like this, what do you have? Instead, you have people who are more familiar with PR and trade. You don't have people.
But this is not a team, Colonel. This is the problem. I don't
Okay, I agree. It comes into addition that there is no unity in that, and that comes into no surprise there, because if you remember the first mandate of Trump, that was the same thing. He changed his state secretary several times, the head of the CIA several times, and the defense secretary as well. So meaning that it's a constant movement. And obviously having this kind of teamwork, it's not even teamwork, but working that way doesn't bring any consistency, intellectual, long-term, strategic consistency. You cannot achieve that. And this is the same this time. The problem is that you cannot run, in my view, you cannot run a country as you would run your business in New York City. That's my personal view, even if I'm not an experience in running a country, neither to run business in New York City. Again, this is the way he works. He deals exactly as a New York businessman does. He is a man of opportunities, take opportunities, decides very quickly, and it works or it fails, doesn't matter. If there's something fails, there is something else to do, and things like this is exactly as he would run his business in New York City. And it's exactly how you figure out a businessman in New York works. Jumping from opportunity to opportunity, and that's it. But no real long-term plan. Besides the fact of being rich, there is no real strategy behind. There's a succession of tactical operations, if you want, or tactical actions. And that's exactly the way he works, the way he performs. But again, my feeling is that there's little understanding of the complexity of the situation. There is probably little understanding of what we want to achieve at the end of the day, because we see this kind of competition we have among the people within the Trump administration, but not just that, because there's also the influence of all these people such as Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, and others who obviously try to be even more radical than we imagine possible. And this kind of mess with tariffs and sanctions that you apply here and there, and you have tariffs for economic purposes, protectionist purposes, you have tariffs applied for policy purposes, such as in Brazil, because you like Bolsonaro, you don't like the Brazilian president. Exactly. And therefore, you apply tariffs because you don't want him to do so. And so this is totally messy in the approach. And as viewed from the outside, you cannot identify a process. You cannot identify a trend. You cannot identify something you can really grasp in order to address a response, or probably even to negotiate. Because you do not know exactly what to negotiate about. And that's also something we have seen with those tariffs and all that. So it's extremely strange, this way of doing. But the reality is that everything is so confused, and you can see so many people having different interpretation of the deal with this country or this that, and Trump wanting to attack Greenland and Greenland, and then no and yes, and Denmark moving troops in Greenland, and there's a total confusion. We don't know who are our allies. We don't know exactly who are our friends. The friends of today is probably the enemy of tomorrow, or vice versa. You don't know exactly how to deal with things. And this is extremely confusing. And that's translates again. I don't want to enter the discussion on the economic side, but you feel that at economic level with the uncertainties that develop in as to the dollar, as to the relationship with China, the rare earth and all that, starts to play a strategic role suddenly, although it has never been a theme before. But that was exemplified with Europe, where they felt they did a fantastic, von der Leyen felt she had done a fantastic agreement to achieve stability in the relationship. What kind of stability? What are we talking about exactly? She felt she had not even herself a representation of what needed to be done. She just did, and she just obeyed to Donald Trump in order to avoid more problems. That's what she calls stability, probably. But by doing so, she sacrificed the interest of millions of people in Europe. So, what we have here, and that's fascinating because we have a European Union that has always bragged its willingness to make war and support Ukraine and things like this. And they never used the tools they had, or it had, in terms of diplomacy and foreign policy. And Josep Borrell was just inexistent, and Kaya Kallas is not even non-existent. She's, in addition to that, she's even more stupid than Josep Borrell was, and she has a mental fixation on Russia. I mean, everything has to be related to, even when she goes negotiating with China for, and obviously there are a lot of issues between China and Europe, but no, the only issue she has in mind is Russia. So it's an obsession, and that this obsessive nature of the foreign policy of EU has just destroyed foreign policy. They made EU totally irrelevant and totally not credible on the international stage. And for that reason, by the way, they are not even invited to in Alaska, because they bring absolutely no added value. The Europe has brings absolutely no added value to any discussion, because they have not developed any kind of discussion network or things like that what you would expect from a foreign policy institution such the External Action Service of the European Union, which is in essence a foreign ministry, if you want, for the European Union. And this institution has in fact cut every ties with everything that is close to Russia. Therefore, how can you expect any positive result? Can it added value in involving those guys into a discussion? Therefore, that European Union, as seen from Russia, has absolutely no value. It's just a troublemaker because it wants to be active militarily. It has absolutely not constructed any foreign policy and diplomatic capacities. And therefore, in a discussion as the one we may have in a few days in Alaska, European Union is irrelevant. In any case, we have this quite odd situation that because Europe feel itself such a military and geopolitical organization, Russia may well add to its demands the fact that Ukraine should not be member of the EU, which has never been the case. Even though in 2013, it was, if you read the media at that time, all the media said that Russia was preventing Ukraine to enter or to associate with Ukraine. That's wrong. In fact, at that time, the problem was that the Ukrainian government had to choose between a free trade union with Russia and a free trade union with European Union. And since the government at that time didn't want to break relationship with Russia, Russia said, we have no problem if we have this kind of triangular relationship. That means that you keep a free trade union with Russia and you have a free trade union with Europe. We have no problem with that. But that was Manuel José Barroso, the predecessor of Ursula von der Leyen, by the way, who said, no, no way. And he said to the Ukrainian government, you cannot do that. You have to choose either Russia or EU, period. And that's exactly what, in fact, prompted the start of the Maidan and the Euromaidan event and this revolution and all that, because it was presented in the media as an opposition from Russia. But in reality, it was an opposition of Manuel José Barroso. And I know someone who was part of the negotiation team with Ukraine at that time, and he perfectly confirmed what you had in some media at the time, by the way. I'm not inventing that. This is a historical fact, which is factually proved. Russia had no problem with the European Union as such. But now, because European Union wants to become a military structure, Russia will probably make every effort to prevent that, to prevent the Ukraine joining EU. Now, EU is led by idiots. I think there is barely another more polite term for that, because Europe, and we see, it's interesting that after the announcement of the meeting in Alaska for the 15th of August, some head of government and Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron, some others made a public statement in which they declare that they support active diplomacy to solve the situation. That's funny, because these people who make this official statement that they support active diplomacy are precisely those who refused to use diplomacy to even talk to Russia. And that's exactly what Sergei Lavrov said if I'm not wrong, in April 2023, when he said that EU is becoming a smaller NATO. And therefore, the more time goes, the more the Russians are reluctant to allow Ukraine to enter another military organization under the name of EU. Would EU remain an economic organization? Would be no problem for Russia, because it would probably make sense, probably not for the taxpayers in Europe, but it would make some sense to have EU to help the reconstruction of Ukraine. But my feeling is that in the Trump team at large, have only few people who understand really what is at stake for the various actors, and therefore they're incapable of developing proper strategies. We have discussed already in previous programs that Trump has an advantage as opposed to EU. EU has no objectives and therefore no strategy. The strategy being the way to address the objective, in fact, or to reach the objective. At least Trump has an objective as regards Ukraine, and it's to get out of the conflict. He doesn't want to solve it. He doesn't want to have peace. He just wants to have the US out of it. Okay, that's his objective. Why not? The problem is that he has not been able to elaborate a strategy that allows to reach that objective. He goes by trial and errors. This is how he goes. And now he will try this negotiation. I think it's a good move, provided he understands what is at stake from on the Russian side. If he doesn't, then the whole thing will be for nothing. So therefore, this picture, the whole picture that I just made, is interesting because I have the feeling that the European leaders had absolutely no idea of this picture. They just go driven by their own feelings. And that's exactly what with Emmanuel Macron and all that. And that explains his flip-flop type of leadership where he says everything and it's opposite 2 days later. Because in fact, those leaders in Europe at large, that includes Ursula von der Leyen and all that. But so at European Union level, as well as at country level, that applies to all our countries, they are not leaders, they are tweeters. They just make tweets. They need to have immediate response to every solicitation. And that's the exact opposite of the way intelligence work. Intelligence is not about tweeting things. Intelligence is about gathering information, analyzing this information, provide assessments, options based on the facts you have, and all that takes time. You need to have some distance, you need to have an overview on things, especially when it comes to strategic issues such as Ukraine. And that's exactly the opposite of the guys who respond just by tweeting, because he has no distance with the event. He has a very strong reaction. Donald Trump exemplifies this type of leadership. And that explains also why he's flip-flopping also. And he goes two steps forward, 3 steps backwards, and so on and so forth. You never know exactly where you stand. And that's exactly what is the weakness of the US today, because we are not addressing the economic side, but this is a key aspect of the economic weakness of the US today, despite the very high and big potential of the country. So we see this lack of reliance on intelligence, and not just intelligence, but intelligent intelligence, if you want, because it's not about political intelligence here. It's about the factual intelligence. Because everything I say, and some people say when they read my books, they say, you predicted everything. No, I didn't predict things. I just analyzed the facts. And based on that, you can derive what the possible outcome of everything. And this is just fact-based. This doesn't require any crystal ball or thing like this. But if I am able to do that here in my office here, how come an intelligence agency is not able to do that? You should ask ourselves this question. Because so far, everything I have in my book has proved true. And this is all based on open information. And this is all based on, let's say, a sober analysis of the event and the facts, because I try to disregard any political assumption. I don't care about who is Putin or Medvedev, and I don't care. I'm not married with a Russian. I have Russian family, and I have no relationship with Ukraine, with whoever. So I can have a very candid understanding of the situation. And this candid situation brings me much further than most of the leaders today. And the problem is, again, it's not about agreeing with Putin or whoever. But when you plan to have a meeting, when you plan to have a policy, when you plan to have a strategy to define objectives and all that,